Another thing that we can check in regards to this activity form submission is the fact that after form submission, the page will always be scrolled to the very bottom. So as I'm submitting this form, every time new activity is created, and the page is scrolled to the bottom. So let's reproduce this behavior in our tests. I'm gonna create new test and rename this scenario. Here I'm gonna say it scrolls page to the bottom after form submission. So let's think what we have to do in order to reproduce this behavior. First of all, we have to render the component. I'm going to use shallow mount function for this. And then we need to populate input field and submit the form in order to have the page scrolled to the bottom. Here I'm using setValue method to populate input field with random value, and then I'm gonna call trigger on the form element to submit the form. So let's figure out what actually makes the page to be scrolled to the bottom after form submission. The moment we submit the form, this submit local function will be fired, and as the last statement in this function, we're having this scroll to method call, which makes the page to be scrolled to the bottom. So we can actually make sure in our test that this method will be called the moment we submit the form. Let's create the spy for it. I'm gonna call it scroll to spy, and then to create the spy object, we're calling spy on method, which takes two parameters. First one will be an object that has method that we are about to spy on, and the second parameter should be the method name itself. And because we have to ensure that this spy will be called after we will submit the form, let's write an expectation and call it to be called times method and specify how many times the method scroll2 has to be called. In our case, only once. But for some reason the test is failing, which means that method has never been called. So what's going on in here? Actually, Vue applies updates to the DOM asynchronously, but this test is being executed synchronously. So Vue doesn't get a chance to update the DOM and scroll the page to the bottom, because Vitest finishes test execution much faster. So we have to make this function asynchronous and make Vitest to wait until Vue will update the DOM. So let's also use a wait keyword in front of these actions to make the test wait for DOM updates, like so. And this time test is passing. Next I'm going to make sure that the scroll2 method is going to be called with arguments that we expect. So I'm gonna duplicate this line, call the method to be called with, and then let's see what arguments scroll2 method is called with. So we have two arguments. Let's copy over these arguments and paste it into this method call. So we are expecting scroll2 method to be called exactly with two arguments. And at the end, it's a good practice to restore all mocks that we have created in the test, so they will not interfere with other test execution. And we are restoring mocks by calling restore all mocks method like this. Let's also verify that this test is actually testing the behavior that we expect. If I'm gonna comment out this line that submits the form, in this case, the test is supposed to fail. And indeed, it is failing. Another thing that is going to make this test fail is that when we comment out this line, which actually scrolls the page, we're seeing that the test is failing again. Alright, now that we are done with this scenario, let's test another scenario. This one will be easier to test, so we only have to check that after we submit this form, the input field will be automatically cleared. So let's copy over existing testing scenario, rename the description. I'm going to say that it clears input after form submission. We can also use shallow mount function to render this component for this test. And then after we populate input field, first of all we're gonna check that this input will not be empty and actually contain string reading, and we can access value of the input by references, element property, and then value property, like this. And let's compare the value that we receive with reading string. And of course, what's most important here to check is that after form submission, we're expecting this input to be empty. So in here we're comparing the value of the input with an empty string. And sure enough, the test is passing. But the moment I'm going to comment out the line which is responsible for clearing out the input, right away we're going to notice the test started to fail. And that is good because that is intentional failure. So that's about it. Let's get back to test, remove modifier only, and run all tests in the project. All of them are passing. Let's continue writing tests in the next lesson.